Castle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to rise today to speak in support of the amendments moved by the member for Hunter with regards to this matter of the restoration of an Inspector General of live animal exports. Because this bill before the House today really goes to the fundamental question of the day, and that is really, why has it taken the government so long? Why did so many animals have to suffer so terribly before this government finally acted? Before taking this one important, albeit quite modest step towards a more robust regulatory regime? I'll say up front that Labor will support this legislation, but the fact that we are only seeing it now is a matter of grave concern. The bill before us today establishes the independent role of the Inspector General of live animal exports to oversee the regulation of the livestock export trade. In doing so, it presents a stark and damning confession from the Morrison government that they got it horribly wrong on live animal exports. Because, of course, it was the former Labor government which created the position of an Inspector General of Animal Welfare and live animal exports, a vital role that provided independent oversight and confidence in the industry. But it was promptly abolished by the Abbott government on coming to power. It's yet more evidence that the Liberals can always be relied upon to stymie oversight and shut down scrutiny, especially if it helps lucrative business operations. As I mentioned, this bill is a glaring mea culpa, an admission that the Liberal government's abolition of the independent inspector role was a diabolical failure, a failure that led to untold acts of cruelty against innocent animals. But sadly, if you think the government had discovered its moral compass all of its own accord and voluntarily moved to a greater oversight and transparency for this sensitive and troubled industry, you'd be wrong. In fact, it took the revulsion and fury of an entire country on the back of a shocking episode of 60 Minutes, which showed secret footage of sickeningly cruel form of live export ship on its way to the Middle East. And even then the government sat on its hands for almost a year and a half, and a damning report into the actions of the relevant department before bringing this bill to Parliament. The government's decision to remove oversight of this sensitive industry, especially given its troubling history, is shocking. It took a TV expose to force them to do the right thing. And then the fact that a further 17 months transpired in order to act is unforgivable. This is a government that cannot be trusted with animal welfare. Indeed, they've broadcast this in no uncertain terms by removing the words animal welfare from the Inspector General's title. While Labor will support this bill because, frankly, it's an improvement on the earlier do-nothing approach, we call on the government to fix the rot that we know is at the core of the department that is supposed to oversee the live sheep export trade. Like the rest of the country, I was shocked, horrified and angered by what I saw on 60 Minutes in April last year. Australia recoiled as we saw thousands of sheep crammed shoulder to shoulder, standing in piles of their own excrement, desperately panting to try and overcome the deadly heat. Many failed, and their corpses were either left to rot or callously tossed over the ship's edge to sea. When these dreadful revelations came to light, Labor called for action. From opposition, we worked closely with key stakeholders, experts and community groups to develop a strong solution, including a plan to put an end to the cruel and inhumane live sheep export trade. We listened to the scientists when they said that these sorts of temperatures were absolutely incompatible with animal welfare. We wanted a review of the Exporter Supply Chain Assurance Scheme, ESCAS. We called for a staged phase-out of the live sheep trade and support for sheep producers to make sheep meat producers to make the transition to a more domestic processing. We urged an immediate stop to the brutal northern summer live trade, which saw animals subjected to searing and deadly temperatures. And of course, we demanded the government reinstate the important Inspector General of Animal Welfare and Live Animal Export positions that the former Labor government had created. Despite nationwide outrage and unquestionable culpability, the government showed no sign that it understood the severity of the revelations. To be fair, the minister at the time, the member for Maranoa, David Littleproud, did seem to be acting with largely good intention, but it was clear that neither senior Liberals nor indeed the Prime Minister shared his level of concern. Perhaps that's why he's no longer in the same position today. It's almost unfathomable how so many of his colleagues on the other side could be so disinterested in addressing such abject cruelty and terrible suffering. Although I also like to note that a few of his government colleagues did actually speak out. Indeed, the member for Farrer, Susan Ley, even had her own private member's bill to shut down this cruel trade. It was seconded by the former member for Corangamite, Sarah Henderson. But the powers that be in the Morrison government promptly silenced these two members by giving them ministries, trying to lure them into a position where they could no longer have their own voices with which to speak out on abominable Liberal Party policy. Regretfully, the two honourable members chose their ministerial positions over their consciences and promptly abandoned the private member's bill along with their ethics. That's why Labor put forward amendments to the government's live export legislation to mirror exactly what was in the member for Farrer's bill. We wanted to give members of the government a chance to have input, to vote with their principles on this critical issue of animal welfare. And do you know what happened then? That's right. The government got so scared that they would lose the vote that they actually pulled the legislation from the agenda, minutes before the debate was due to start. Terrified to test the willingness of their own people to choose the party line over doing the right thing, they cut off the dissent they were so clearly expecting. Rarely do we see such overt acts of shutting down the democratic process. That is the shameful history of how we have got to this point today. So finally, now we have a bill before the House to establish the role of an independent Inspector General of Live Animal Exports. This role is designed to provide an extra layer of accountability to Australia's live export regulation system, to make recommendations and to promote ongoing improvement within the department. Importantly, the Inspector General will have the power to compel any Australian to divulge relevant information or documents. The Inspector General will then deliver reports on any reviews and will submit an annual report, all of which must be made public. This will increase transparency and provide assurance to the community, trading partners and industry alike, that our regulatory system is doing what the government says it is. This role is important, and it's exactly why Labor created it when we were in government. In fact, this position was initiated by the member for Hunter as Agricultural Minister in July 2013 to build on a regulatory framework for the export of livestock for slaughter. We knew that the changes we had made to the Exporter Supply Chain Assurance Scheme had substantially improved the regulatory regime, but we still needed another layer of independent oversight to give the Australian people confidence in the system. The Inspector-General would have added another layer of assurance that our regulatory system was delivering on animal welfare outcomes through an auditing and reviewing process, ensuring that investigations into compliance were also undertaken. There would have been no additional burden of red tape on the exporters or on our trading partners through the development of this role. Of course, the then Abbott government came to power. It took the keys from the ministerial wing in September 2013 and promptly abolished the role of Inspector-General of Animal Welfare and Live Animal Exports the following month in October 2013. At the time, the Minister for Agriculture, Barnaby Joyce, claimed that the Inspector-General role was, and I quote, "a classic example of layer upon layer bureaucracy without any practical outcome." He went on to say, and I quote again, "The livestock export regulator was already and remains subject to appropriate oversight and review mechanisms." And he proclaimed, "This is one bit of red tape we can do without." Of course, in doing so, he not only shut down an important opportunity for oversight, transparency and system integrity, he also sent a very clear message to rogue operators that this was a government that would not get in their way, that they would turn a blind eye if they wanted to cut corners or blatantly break rules on animal welfare. And as history tells us, that's exactly what transpired. And of course, he had a similarly damaging and dangerous message to his own department, a message that they should get out of the way of industry, taking a light touch on regulation and enforcement instead. It's very easy to see how this sort of message can lead to serious systemic issues. Indeed, that's exactly what was found in the independent review of the capability and culture of the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources to regulate live animal exports. The Moss Review, as it came to be known, was released in November last year, and its findings were damning. It painted a picture of a department so starved of resources as a result of government cuts that it simply could not do its job. It showed an organisation which was so conflicted, so allied with industry, that it failed to properly undertake its regulatory role, instead choosing a pathway of least resistance that would later be shockingly revealed by journalists in those terrible episodes we saw on 60 Minutes many months later. And it demonstrated a culture that turned a blind eye to overt breaches of animal welfare standards, leading to the catastrophic consequences it took journalists to reveal. The big question is, how did the government allow this all to happen? Why was political expediency allowed to take precedence over the integrity of government? What happened to the frank and fearless advice of public service that should operate as a check and balance on this sort of toxic and compromised culture? And where was the minister when all this filthy rot was settling in? The Moss Review put forward 31 recommendations. Regretfully, there are not too many that this government has enacted on. I'm pleased that the government has come to its senses, at least with this bill before the House today. I'm pleased that the new minister, Senator Bridget McKenzie, has since squashed the member for New England's claims, saying, and I quote, "A suitably empowered Inspector-General of Live Animal Exports will provide an additional independent layer of accountability and assurance over the regulation of Australia's livestock exports." It's just a shame that it has taken over 6 years for the Liberal and coalition government to evolve sufficiently enough to at least get us to the place where Australians can be assured of having some protective framework in place over the live animal export industry. But this isn't enough. True to the Inspector General offers much-needed independent oversight, but there's still a lot of deep systemic problems within the department that have been identified by this Moss review.